You know, there's this certain expectation we all have when we sit down to analyze a major geopolitical crisis.
Right.
We kind of expect precision. Like we look for the map. We want to see the solid lines showing the borders, the color-coded troop movements, the neatly defined zones of control.
Yeah, the traditional war room setup.
Exactly. We want someone to point at a screen and say, here is the front line. Here is the objective.
Yeah.
Because we crave that binary simplicity, right?
Yeah.
Friendly or hostile, action and reaction.
It's a very 20th century way of looking at conflict, honestly. I mean, we want military actions to fit into a spreadsheet. We want to see a clear correlation between, the tonnage of bombs dropped and the square mileage of territory gained. But modern asymmetric warfare completely shatters that framework.
And that is exactly what we're confronting today.
Yeah.
When you step into the reality of the 2026 Iran war, what a lot of analysts and historians are, they're already calling it the Ramadan war, that neat color-coded map is totally useless.
Absolutely useless.
We are staring at a strategic, economic, and frankly, a humanitarian landscape that is just incredibly murky, it's chaotic, it's nonlinear, and it is actively bleeding into the daily lives of people who live like thousands of miles away from the Persian Gulf.
Because the diagnostic tools we usually use to measure the success or failure of a military campaign, they simply do not apply here. I mean, we are dealing with intersecting crises. You have state decapitation, asymmetric naval blockades, unprecedented ecological disasters, and a global supply chain that is essentially having a heart attack right now.
Which is why you are here with us today. You're looking for a thorough, fast-paced, and just a relentless extraction of the facts regarding one of the most complex geopolitical powder kegs of our lifetime. Yeah. Just to anchor us, today is July 15th, 2026. Yeah. And you want to understand the timeline, the tactical decisions, the economic shockwaves, and the staggering human toll of this conflict. And just to level set with you before we really dive into the deep end here, the sources we are unpacking today for this deep dive, they cover highly charged, incredibly violent, and politically polarizing events involving the United States, Israel, and Iran.
Yeah, there's a lot of heat around this topic.
So much heat. So our job today is not to play politician. We aren't here to pick sides. We're not justifying actions or endorsing any political viewpoints. Our sole objective is to impartially extract the raw data, the military briefings, the humanitarian reports from agencies like ACCAPES, and the economic data from the UN World Food Program, so you can just see the mechanics of this crisis for yourself.
Right, because if you don't understand the underlying mechanics, if you don't understand how a destroyed communications tower in Tehran somehow translates into a food shortage in sub-Saharan Africa, you just cannot grasp the magnitude of what is happening on a global scale right this second.
Exactly. So let's start at the source of the fracture. To understand the absolute gridlock we're facing today, July 15, we have to rewind. We have to look at the spark that instantly transformed the Middle East, February 28th, 2026.
The assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei.
Right. Now, I know the stated goal of the U.S. and Israel was a decapitation strike, but I really want to get a sense of the sheer physical scale of this opening move. Because when I hear the word assassination, I think of, a surgical isolated drone strike, a targeted hit. Was that the case here?
No. The term assassination almost does a disservice to the scale of what actually occurred on February 28th. It wasn't a solitary drone loitering over a convoy somewhere. This was a deluge.
A deluge.
Yeah, Israel codenamed it Operation Roaring Lion. And to give you the specific data points from the military primers we've been looking at, in a single 24-hour period, the Israeli Air Force struck 500 distinct military targets inside Iranian territory. They dropped over 1,200 precision-guided munitions. I mean, this was, by a massive margin, the largest combat sortie in the entire history of the Israeli Air Force.
500 targets in 24 hours. I mean, that requires an overwhelming amount of logistical coordination. That's not just, dropping bombs. That's suppressing air defenses, managing airspace, air-to-air refueling.
The logistical footprint is staggering, yeah. But what is equally critical is where those munitions were actually directed. They didn't just target peripheral military outposts or, remote missile silos in the mountains. They drove a spear directly into the heart of the Iranian state apparatus.
Right.
The primary focal point was the Pastor Street district in central Tehran. And this is the highly fortified compound that houses the presidential palace, the Supreme National Security Council, and basically the core of the regime's leadership infrastructure.
And the human toll within that leadership circle was absolute. I mean, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. But the sources detail that he wasn't the only high-value target eliminated.
No, not at all.
The casualty list included thousands of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC personnel, and the collateral damage within the compound made this deeply, deeply personal for the regime's surviving elite. Khamenei's daughter, his grandchild, and his daughter-in-law, Zahra Hadad, they were all killed in those initial strikes on the Pasir district.
Yeah, it was a systemic attempt to paralyze the command and control structure of the Iranian government instantaneously. But to truly understand why this trigger was pulled on February 28, you have to look at the momentum building in the weeks prior.
Right, this didn't just happen out of nowhere.
Exactly. It didn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
Throughout January 2026, the Iranian government had launched this brutally violent crackdown on massive anti-government protests that were sweeping their own country. The reports indicate massacres resulting in thousands of civilian deaths.
And that January crackdown was the stated catalyst for the Trump administration to order a massive military mobilization in response. Our sources describe this as the largest buildup of U.S. air and naval assets in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq back in 2003.
The scale of the U.S. deployment was immense. I mean, we are talking about 2 full carrier strike groups operating in the region. That means nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, flanked by guided missile cruisers, destroyers, attack submarines, coupled with hundreds of aircraft positioned at Allied bases all across the Persian Gulf and the Levant. The U.S. essentially maximized its logistical and strike capabilities in the theater.
Right, and the U.S. administration cited several justifications for this unprecedented mobilization. They stated the necessity of preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. They explicitly outlined regime change as an objective. And they emphasized the need to secure the region's oil and natural gas resources.
Yeah, those were the stated goals.
But looking at the strategy, I have to question the underlying logic here. From a layman's perspective, this strategy looks like kicking over a massive hornet's nest, completely vaporizing the nest with a shotgun, and then immediately deciding to build a massive permanent fortress right next to the angry, scattered swarm.
That's a pretty vivid way to put it.
Was the strategic goal merely to decapitate the regime, or was there this assumption that overwhelming force would draw Iran into a conventional war, like a war of planes and tanks that they physically couldn't win?
That assumption is precisely where the friction between U.S. doctrine and Iranian reality occurs. You see, the United States and Israel applied a doctrine of overwhelming conventional superiority. They utilized total air dominance, stealth technology, massive payload delivery.
Right, the traditional playbook.
Exactly. And if you are fighting a conventional state military, a decapitation strike of that magnitude usually forces a surrender because the hierarchical chain of command just collapses. But the Iranian military apparatus is not designed to fight a conventional war against a superpower.
I know they'd lose.
They know they cannot compete with U.S. air superiority, so they don't even try. They rely on what military strategists call a mosaic defense strategy.
Okay, I want to pause on that, Turp, because mosaic defense seems to be the absolute linchpin of everything that happens next. Break down the mechanics of that. How does a mosaic defense actually operate when the central leadership is just suddenly gone?
So a traditional military is like a pyramid, right?
Yeah.
If you remove the capstone, the structure loses its structural integrity. A mosaic defense is designed more like a decentralized web. It anticipates the loss of central leadership.
Oh, wow. So you've got a plan for it.
They expect it. Instead of relying on a top-down command for every tactical decision, authority and capabilities are distributed across a vast, localized network of asymmetric assets. We are talking about thousands of mobile ballistic missile launchers, drone swarms hidden in subterranean tunnels, and heavily armed regional proxy militias, often referred to as the Axis of Resistance, scattered across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen.
So it's essentially pre-delegated authority. The localized commanders, they don't need a phone call from Tehran to know what to do if the capital gets hit.
Exactly. The doctrine is designed to absorb a massive initial conventional blow, even a decapitation strike, and then bleed the attacker through 1,000 uncoordinated, dispersed counterattacks across an entire geographic region. It is a strategy of attrition, not territory.
Which perfectly explains the immediate aftermath of February 28. 2 days after the assassination, the mosaic defense activates externally. Hezbollah in Lebanon starts firing barrages of rockets into northern Israel, which triggers the 2026 Lebanon war.
Right.
Concurrently, you've got Iraqi proxy militias assaulting U.S. military bases in Iraq and Syria, while the Houthi movement in Yemen escalates missile launches. The conflict instantly metastasized across multiple borders. But while the external proxy network was functioning autonomously, the internal reality within Iran's borders was, it was catastrophic.
Yeah, the domestic situation devolved rapidly.
The decapitation strike didn't just eliminate military targets, it shattered the structural integrity of the Iranian state.
The military strikes achieved their goal of fracturing the central government, creating this profound power vacuum at the absolute worst possible time for the civilian population.
Let's look at the logistics of that power struggle because it's wild. Ali Khamenei is dead. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, is rapidly elected by the Assembly of Experts on March 8 to replace his father as supreme leader. But the reports show he immediately goes into hiding.
Yeah, he vanished.
In fact, as late as May, the New York Times reported that the Iranian leadership was completely paralyzed, and Mojtaba was still essentially operating as a phantom leader in these secure, undisclosed locations. How do you run a country, let alone a country at war, when the head of state is completely invisible?
The short answer is you don't. The paralysis wasn't just a result of Mojtaba Khamenei's physical absence either. It was driven by the physical destruction of the nation's communication infrastructure.
Because of the bombings.
Exactly. The conventional strikes heavily targeted communication nodes. When you sever the lines of communication between government ministries, provincial governors, and military commanders, you immediately breed paranoia. In a closed regime like that, if the left hand literally cannot talk to the right hand, factions begin to turn on each other.
And into that vacuum steps a very specific figure. The sources highlight General Ahmad Vahidi, a prominent hardliner. With the civilian and religious leadership either dead, hiding, or disconnected, Vahidi effectively takes central command of the IRGC.
Right.
He becomes the de facto architect of Iran's military response and their uncompromising negotiation stance.
And Vahidi's consolidation of power represents the complete militarization of the Iranian state structure. The civilian government agencies essentially cease to function altogether, leaving the IRGC as the sole arbiter of state resources.
And the civilian population was just trapped in the middle of this structural collapse. The humanitarian numbers we are looking at are, frankly, difficult to comprehend. By mid-March, just weeks into the conflict, humanitarian agencies recorded 3.2 million internally displaced persons, or IDPs.
It was a mass exodus.
In the first 48 hours alone, over 100,000 civilians fled the capital city of Tehran.
The displacement patterns outline the geography of the terror. Civilians were fleeing the major urban centers that were absorbing the brunt of the conventional airstrikes cities, like Tehran, Avaz, Isfahan. They were migrating toward rural districts and the northern provinces near the Caspian Sea, desperately seeking areas they perceived as having less strategic military value.
The on-the-ground reports described Tehran in those early days as a literal ghost town. The streets were completely empty, commercial activity ceased, shops were shuttered. But what amplifies this nightmare is the information blackout.
Right, the internet drops.
The combination of the government's own restrictive measures and the physical destruction of infrastructure dropped the country's internet connectivity to roughly 1% of its normal capacity.
It is so difficult for those of us living in highly connected societies to truly grasp the terror of a 99% reduction in connectivity during a war. Imagine being a civilian in a dense urban environment under heavy, continuous aerial bombardment. You have zero access to real-time updates.
You can't even check the news.
You cannot check maps for safe evacuation routes. You cannot access banking applications to secure funds. You cannot even send a text message to confirm if your family members in the next neighborhood are alive. You are completely terrifyingly blind.
And that blindness, combined with the chaotic nature of the strikes, led to unspeakable tragedies. The sources detailed the Manab girls' school strike on the very first day, February 28.
Yeah, that was horrific.
According to the declassified U.S. military investigations, a U.S. Tomahawk cruise missile struck an elementary school in Manab, resulting in the deaths of over 170 children. When a state's infrastructure is too broken to provide early warning systems or coordinate any emergency response, the lethality of every single strike is magnified exponentially.
Furthermore, this acute kinetic trauma was layered on top of an unfolding environmental and economic collapse. The timing of this war collided with a period of severe ecological stress across the region.
The climate data in these reports is staggering. ACKPS reported that by mid-July, right around the time we are discussing now, southern Iran claimed 8 of the 10 hottest recorded temperatures on the entire planet. The city of Bostan recorded a temperature of 51.6 degrees Celsius. For those of us using Fahrenheit, that is 125 degrees.
And this wasn't, a dry heat experience in an air-conditioned environment. The civilian population was enduring 125-degree temperatures alongside chronic systemic water shortages.
Because the grid was gone.
Right. Airstrikes had damaged municipal water pumping stations, and the power grid was failing, resulting in continuous rolling blackouts. You cannot pump water without electricity, and you cannot survive 125 degrees without water.
Which brings up a glaring, tragic irony detailed in the energy reports. While millions of civilians are suffering in the dark, unable to run a fan or a refrigerator, the Iranian regime was simultaneously flaring massive amounts of natural gas. The data shows they were flaring nearly 30 billion cubic meters of gas.
It's an astronomical waste.
That is the equivalent of wasting 65% of their total domestic consumption. Why on earth would a regime facing an energy crisis literally burn off that much fuel into the atmosphere?
Well, flaring is a symptom of degraded infrastructure. When you extract oil, natural gas comes up with it as a byproduct. If you don't have the advanced pipelines, processing facilities, and storage infrastructure to capture, transport, and utilize that gas, your only option is to brain it off, to flare it, to prevent dangerous pressure buildups at the wellhead.
So they didn't have a choice.
Years of sanctions had prevented Iran from acquiring the technology to capture that gas. So you had the visually apocalyptic scenario of massive pillars of fire illuminating the night sky, burning billions of dollars of energy, while the cities below sat in complete sweltering darkness.
And the domestic fury regarding this was palpable. Leaked state findings indicated that 82% of the Iranian population was struggling just to secure basic food staples, and 75% could not afford even basic medical care. Residents in cities like Abadan were quoted saying, "They are taking the leader's revenge out on the people of Iran."
The resentment was huge.
The public was squarely blaming the regime's uncompromising military posture for their daily suffering. But I have a fundamental question about the timeline of this collapse. We often talk about the fog of war and the devastating impact of airstrikes. But looking at these economic and ecological numbers, how much of this structural collapse was actually caused by the 1,200 bombs dropped on February 28, and how much of it was a pre-existing condition?
That distinction is paramount to understanding Iran's strategic vulnerability. The foundation of the Iranian state, its economy, and its infrastructure was incredibly brittle long before the first siren sounded. Decades of heavy international sanctions, severe currency depreciation, and vast internal economic mismanagement had completely hollowed out the system.
So it was already crumbling.
Before the war even began, the official inflation rate was hovering over 48%. The supply chains for medicine and basic goods were already operating on incredibly thin margins.
And the water crisis wasn't caused by a bomb, right?
No, the water crisis was systemic and pre-existing. It was driven by years of climate change-induced droughts, coupled with highly inefficient government-subsidized agricultural practices that had rapidly depleted their aquifers. The dam reservoirs supplying major urban centers like Tehran were already sitting at historically low crisis levels before February 28. So the war was not the sole cause of the collapse. To go back to analogies, the war was a massive earthquake that struck a house already eaten through by termites. The conventional strikes simply shattered the fragile, makeshift supply chains that were barely keeping the population fed and medicated.
Okay, so let's look at the board from the perspective of General Vahidi and the IRGC command.
Right.
Your central leadership is gone. Your infrastructure is burning. Your civilian population is enduring a 125-degree heat wave with no water, no power, and 82% of them can't find food. The conventional military superiority of the U.S. and Israel is systematically dismantling your state. Your regime is facing an existential threat of absolute destruction. What is your play? You go to the only card you have left.
Right, you go for the ultimate global choke point.
They move to shut down the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly.
Let's lay out the sheer geographical and economic facts of the Strait of Hormuz, because this is the exact mechanism where a regional war instantly becomes a global crisis. The strait is a waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the open ocean. At its narrowest point, it is just 21 miles wide.
Barely a stone's throw in naval terms.
But through that narrow 21-mile gap flows 25% of the entire world's seaborne oil supply and 20% of the global liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
It is, without exaggeration, the single most critical jugular vein of the global energy market. The entire modern industrial economy relies on the uninterrupted flow of vessels through that specific corridor.
So Iran activates a blockade. The IRGC begins aggressively boarding international merchant ships. They deploy fast attack craft to harass tankers, and crucially, they begin laying fields of sea mines. On March 27, they make it official. Tehran declares the strait entirely closed to all vessels associated with the U.S., Israel, and any of their allied nations.
The United States naturally cannot allow a hostile power to unilaterally sever a quarter of the global energy supply, so they counter-escalate it.
Right.
Starting in mid-April, the U.S. Navy instituted its own comprehensive blockade of all Iranian ports. The objective was to completely cut off Iran's ability to collect lucrative shipping tolls and to halt any remaining exports of Iranian oil, effectively suffocating the regime's last major revenue stream.
The economic data shows this U.S. blockade was costing the Iranian government an estimated $435 million every single day in lost revenue. The Guardian aptly labeled this the dual blockade, and it ignited this fascinating, highly dangerous phenomenon that the sources call the routing war.
The routing war is a battle for institutional and physical control over the specific shipping lanes within the waterway. To understand this, you have to look at the geography of the strait. Traditionally, commercial ships use a specific transit corridor. Iran attempted to unilaterally redraw those lines.
How so?
They used the threat of boarding and sea mines to force all commercial shipping traffic into a designated northern route, which hugged the Iranian coastline.
Wait, I need to visualize this. The strait is 21 miles wide. If the U.S. Navy, with its carrier strike groups and destroyers, is sitting right there blockading Iranian ports, how is Iran actively forcing massive commercial tankers into a northern route against their will? Why don't the commercial ships just sail right behind the U.S. destroyers on the southern side? I don't understand how Iran maintains authority over these ships when they're so vastly outgunned in the water.
It comes down to the asymmetry of risk. The U.S. Navy has overwhelming firepower, yes, but they cannot physically escort every single commercial tanker 24 hours a day through a 21-mile choke point.
Right, there's just too much traffic.
Iran doesn't need a destroyer to control the strait. They just need to deploy relatively cheap, difficult-to-detect asymmetric weapons. We are talking about moored contact mines, acoustic mines, and magnetic influence mines dropped from small, fast-moving IRGC speedboats in the dead of night.
Just slipping them into the water.
Exactly. And if even one commercial tanker hits a mine, the maritime insurance premiums set by Lloyd's of London skyrocket to levels that make shipping economically impossible. So Iran essentially tells the shipping companies, if you want to guarantee your ship doesn't hit a mine, you use our northern route, you submit to our inspections, and you pay our tolls.
And meanwhile, the U.S., working alongside Oman, which shares the southern coast of the strait, is desperately trying to push that shipping traffic away from Iran. They're widening a southern route, hugging the Omani coast, attempting to establish a safe, institutionalized corridor that entirely bypasses Iranian authority.
Precisely. It is a battle of sovereignty played out over commercial shipping lanes.
It is exactly like two people holding different keys to the exact same massive bank vault. Neither one of them can open the vault alone, but both of them absolutely refuse to turn their key, and in the process, they end up locking everyone else inside the vault with them.
That analogy is incredibly apt, but to take it a step further, Iran isn't just refusing to turn their key. They are actively sliding explosive charges, the sea mines, under the vault door, essentially declaring, if we don't control access to this vault, nobody leaves alive.
Wow.
That is the core of their deterrence strategy. For the IRGC, controlling the Strait of Hormuz isn't just about economics or collecting maritime tolls. It is their hard-won deterrence against the overwhelming military superiority of the United States.
Because they know they can't beat a U.S. F-35 fighter jet in a dogfight.
Exactly. They cannot win a conventional war. But they can hold the global economy hostage. If Iran loses control of the strait, if the U.S. successfully institutionalizes that southern Omani route and renders the Iranian threat obsolete, Iran loses its primary asymmetric leverage. The regime views the loss of the strait as an existential strategic defeat.
And when a vault holding 25% of the world's oil gets locked, the people trapped inside, the rest of the global economy, immediately begin to suffocate. Which brings us to the global shockwaves of this dual blockade.
The ripple effects across international markets were not gradual. They were instantaneous, violent, and pervasive.
Let's start with the most obvious metric, the energy crisis. The sources show that the moment the blockade took effect, we saw the largest single monthly increase in oil prices in recorded history. Brent crude oil, which is the international benchmark for pricing, skyrocketed, peaking at $126 a barrel.
And it wasn't just liquid crude. Natural gas prices surged simultaneously across European and Asian markets. The head of the International Energy Agency was quoted calling this the greatest global energy security challenge in history.
And that profound energy shock instantly grounded the global aviation industry. Commercial airspace across the Middle East was effectively shut down due to the kinetic missile threats. Major carriers canceled flights en masse, causing logistical chaos. But the secondary effect was the sheer cost of aviation fuel. The deep dive sources highlight a very specific, fascinating example of how this played out corporately. Spirit Airlines, the American low-cost carrier.
Oh, yeah, this is a crazy detail.
On May 2, 2026, Spirit Airlines completely ceased operations. They didn't just scale back, they shut down.
The Spirit Airlines collapse perfectly illustrates the fragility of modern corporate margins. Low-cost carriers operate on incredibly thin margins and rely heavily on precise fuel hedging strategies.
Right.
When a geopolitical shock spikes fuel costs by 40 or 50% overnight, a heavily leveraged company with fragile financials simply cannot absorb the blow. Geopolitics instantly bankrupted a domestic U.S. airline. But as disruptive as grounded flights are, there is a hidden casualty in these reports that is far more alarming than the commercial aviation sector.
Yes, this is the detail in the research that completely stopped me in my tracks.
The fertilizers.
Most people do not associate the Persian Gulf with global agriculture, but the statistics provided by the Fertilizer Institute are grim. Nearly 50% of the world's exported urea and sulfur, which are fundamental building blocks for agricultural fertilizers, transit directly through the Strait of Hormuz. Wait, I really want to emphasize the mechanics of this because it's terrifying. Are we saying that a localized naval blockade involving speedboats and sea mines in the Middle East is literally threatening the mathematical ability of farmers in South America or Africa to grow enough crops to feed people?
That is exactly what the data indicates, and it is a compounding two-front crisis. To understand why, you have to look at the chemistry of modern agriculture. The world relies on nitrogen-based fertilizers to maintain crop yields. To create nitrogen fertilizer, you utilize a chemical procedure called the Haber-Bosch process, which synthesizes ammonia.
Okay.
The Haber-Bosch process requires massive, continuous amounts of natural gas as a primary feedstock.
So on one hand, you have the physical naval blockade trapping the finished fertilizer products inside the Persian Gulf. And on the other hand, the global natural gas shortage caused by the blockade makes it vastly more expensive to manufacture new fertilizer anywhere else in the world.
Exactly. You cut off the supply in the product, and you simultaneously spike the cost of the raw ingredients needed to make more of it. Without affordable urea and nitrogen fertilizers, global crop yields plummet.
Which leads directly to the UN World Food Program, issuing these dire, flashing red warnings about looming global food inflation and severe systemic hunger in vulnerable regions. It forces a really uncomfortable question. How long can the highly optimized global supply chain realistically hold its breath while these two militaries stare each other down?
The reality is it can't. The modern global economy is built on the premise of just-in-time logistics. We do not stockpile massive reserves of essential components anymore. We rely on constant, uninterrupted maritime flow. Whether you are looking at aluminum exported from Bahrain, helium required for medical MRI machines coming out of Qatar, or the essential chemical inputs for global agriculture, it all relies on that 21-mile stretch of water.
It's all connected.
A choke point like Hormuz isn't merely a bottleneck. It is an existential vulnerability for global food security and industrial production.
So with the global economy effectively screaming in pain, the sheer crushing economic pressure eventually forced both sides, the United States and Iran, to the negotiating table. Neither side could afford to let the vault stay locked forever. Which leads us to a temporary glimmer of hope that was rapidly extinguished: the collapse of the Islamabad Memorandum.
The economic calamities simply became too vast for either domestic political base to ignore.
So picture the scene. It is June 17, 2026. The diplomatic stage is set at the Palace of Versailles in France. U.S. President Donald Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed what is known as the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, or the MOU. The premise, on paper, sounds incredibly promising: a 60-day pause in all hostilities, a mutual lifting of the naval blockades, and a diplomatic framework where the U.S. would offer major financial and political concessions in exchange for Iran standing down.
But an MOU is not a binding treaty. It is merely a preliminary framework of intent. And in diplomacy, the devil is always in the mechanical implementation of that intent. Despite the grand setting at Versailles, this agreement unraveled in less than 20 days.
Let's break down exactly why it fell apart so quickly. Because the sources outline three massive, irreconcilable sticking points. Sticking point number one: Lebanon. The text of the MOU explicitly called for the respect of Lebanese sovereignty.
Right.
From Iran's perspective, this was a clear mandate that Israel needed to immediately withdraw its forces from southern Lebanon, ending the conflict with Hezbollah.
However, the U.S. interpretation was entirely different. The U.S. immediately opened a parallel diplomatic track, working closely with Israel on a security framework that linked any potential Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon to the complete and verifiable disarmament of Hezbollah forces south of the Litani River.
Oh, so completely different read on the text.
Totally different. Iran viewed this not as diplomacy, but as the U.S. working behind their back to fundamentally alter the balance of power, ensuring Israel maintained a strategic advantage in Lebanon while violating the spirit of the ceasefire.
Sticking point number 2, the strait itself. During the 60-day pause, Iran promised safe passage for all commercial vessels. But their assumption was that ships would resume using the traditional Iranian-controlled northern route, allowing Iran to reassert its sovereignty and collect tolls.
Yeah, back to the routing war.
Right. The U.S., however, continued aggressively advising and pushing commercial shipping traffic into that newly widened southern route near the Omani coast.
This goes right back to the psychology of deterrence we discussed earlier. Iran felt the U.S. was using the cover of a ceasefire to systematically strip away their institutional control of the waterway. They viewed the southern route as a permanent structural threat to their leverage.
And finally, sticking point number 3, the money. The MOU framework included a provision for major financial concessions to Iran. Specifically, Iran demanded immediate access to $26 billion in previously frozen funds that were sitting in escrow accounts in banks located in Qatar and the UAE.
But moving $26 billion to the international banking system is extraordinarily complex, especially when dealing with a heavily sanctioned entity.
There's so much red tape.
Exactly. The negotiations regarding the transfer mechanisms, compliance with SWIFT banking regulations, assurances against secondary sanctions for the Gulf banks completely stalled. The bureaucratic friction was immense, and the result was simple. Iran wasn't getting the money.
It is literally like signing a complex contract to buy a house. You sign the papers, you show up on move-in day, and you find out the seller is secretly renting out the backyard to someone else. They change the locks on the front door, and your bank is trapped in a regulatory nightmare and absolutely refuses to release the funds from escrow. The entire deal was structurally unsound from day one.
The rapid dissolution of the MOU had severe political fallout. President Trump was attending the NATO summit in Turkey shortly after the signing, and reports indicated his frustration was highly visible and vocal.
Yeah, the transcripts from the summit show him openly bashing allied nations, expressing deep frustration about the lack of concrete progress, the messy reality of the implementation.
Because the strategic reality was setting in. An unprecedented 40-day conventional bombing campaign, dropping thousands of munitions and decapitating the state leadership, had fundamentally failed to yield an immediate, unconditional capitulation from Iran.
They just absorbed it.
Iran's decentralized mosaic defense and their willingness to deploy the dual blockade meant they had absorbed a massive kinetic blow and still managed to inflict a strategic stalemate on a superpower. Trump's inability to sell this highly complicated, stalling MOU back home as a definitive victory vastly accelerated its collapse.
Which brings us right out of the history and squarely into the present moment. Today, July 15th, 2026. The diplomatic breakdown hasn't just resulted in angry press conferences, it has manifested into physical fire. We are standing on the absolute brink of all-out war.
The kinetic escalation over the last 48 hours has been severe and sustained.
Let's look at the real-time tactical timeline. Iran has drastically ramped up its asymmetric attacks. In the last day alone, they launched 50 projectiles. That is the highest daily volume of fire we have seen since the April ceasefire. The barrage included 36 drones, and notably, 33 of those strikes were targeting locations in Kuwait alone.
Right.
They are also launching strikes on targets in Bahrain and Jordan. Why focus so heavily on Kuwait?
Kuwait hosts significant U.S. military logistics hubs and air bases. By targeting Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan, Iran is signaling that the entire regional architecture supporting the U.S. military presence is vulnerable to their mosaic defense. It is a rapid, horizontal escalation.
And the U.S. retaliation has been equally swift and heady. U.S. Central Command forces are currently conducting waves of retaliatory airstrikes. They are hitting Iranian military barracks, degrading coastal defense systems, and targeting cruise missile sites in strategic coastal areas like Bushehr, Chabahar, and the heavily fortified Greater Tum Island in the Persian Gulf.
It is a return to high-intensity, kinetic degradation of Iran's maritime strike capabilities.
But it's the rhetoric that is truly hitting a boiling point today. The IRGC issued their ultimate threat regarding the blockade just hours ago. They stated publicly, and I quote, "The export of oil and gas from the region will be either for everyone or for no one."
That's a terrifying statement.
They are threatening to halt all energy exports from the entire Middle East, not just their own, but everyone's.
It is the ultimate manifestation of their asymmetric deterrence. They are threatening a global economic scorched earth policy. This completely forces the hand of the U.S. administration. The U.S. military has officially announced the immediate reimposition of the naval blockade on all Iranian ports.
And looking at the strategic horizon based on today's intelligence leaks, it looks incredibly dark. Sources indicate that President Trump is currently holding continuous Situation Room meetings with his national security team, planning a major U.S. offensive.
Yeah, things are escalating quickly.
And the nature of the targeting seems to be shifting. They aren't just looking at degrading coastal air defenses or radar installations anymore. Reports suggest they are planning to target Iran's core strategic assets. They want to physically force a capitulation on both the Strait of Hormuz blockade and the broader nuclear program.
It represents a massive escalation in the rules of engagement. And adding another dense layer of geopolitical complexity to this timeline, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is scheduled to travel to the United States in just 3 days, on July 18th, for high-level meetings, potentially directly with President Trump. The coordination of a joint military posture is undoubtedly on the table.
So, taking all of this in there, the destroyed infrastructure, the locked global economy, the collapsing diplomacy, and the missiles flying today, where does this actually go?
We are standing at a critical historic inflection point. The United States is attempting to use maximum kinetic military force and absolute economic pressure to physically break Iran's grip on the Strait of Hormuz. But the Iranian regime views that grip as its sole insurance policy against total destruction.
Right, they can't let it go.
The overarching question facing military planners today is, will the U.S. escalate into a full-scale, boots-on-the-ground regional war to manually clear and secure the strait? Military analysts project that operation would require tens of thousands of ground troops and years of occupation.
Which nobody wants.
Or, alternatively, will the U.S. and the global community eventually be forced to accept a new paradigm of Iranian institutional influence over the waterway, simply to save the global economy from a catastrophic inflationary collapse?
It is a terrifying, high-stakes standoff with no clear off-ramp. So, to summarize the intense, brutal journey we've unpacked today, we started on February 28 with a massive, unprecedented decapitation strike. Over 1,000 bombs designed to paralyze a nation, which killed Ali Khamenei and shattered the internal structure of the Iranian state.
Exactly.
That strike triggered a massive internal power vacuum and a humanitarian catastrophe, leaving millions displaced, blind without internet, and struggling to survive in 125-degree heat without power or water.
A collapse that pushed an increasingly desperate Iranian regime to activate its decentralized mosaic defense and slam the door shut on the Strait of Hormuz. That action ignited a dual blockade that is currently suffocating the global supply of crude oil, grounding aviation networks, and threatening the fundamental chemical inputs required for global agriculture.
A brief, desperate attempt at diplomatic resolution through the Islamabad Memorandum collapsed almost instantly under the weight of deep mistrust over proxy forces in Lebanon, control of the shipping lanes, and billions of dollars in frozen banking assets. And now, today, July 15th, the diplomatic window has closed. The missiles are flying in unprecedented numbers, the naval blockades are back in full force, and the global economy is essentially holding its breath, waiting to see who blinks first.
It is a profound, terrifying demonstration of how deeply interconnected our modern economic and security architectures truly are. A localized conflict in the Persian Gulf is directly dictating the price of food in your local grocery store.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to mull over as we watch these events unfold. We have spent the last hour analyzing an asymmetrically armed nation, a country struggling with massive internal poverty, crumbling infrastructure, and a hollowed-out economy. Yet, they have effectively managed to hold 20% of the entire global energy supply hostage. They have absorbed a superpower's massive, overwhelming conventional bombardment without offering a surrender. It makes you wonder, does the Ramadan War mark the definitive end of traditional superpower dominance? Are we entering a new era of global conflict where having control of a narrow, 21-mile geographical choke point actually matters far more than having the world's most advanced air force?
It is a reality that certainly challenges every single assumption built into 20th century military doctrine. The old rules of leverage simply do not apply anymore.
They really don't. Because when you look at that broken, complex reality of the Middle East today, it is undeniably clear that the old diagnostic tools, the neat maps, and the binary assumptions just don't work anymore. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the narratives, keep exploring the deep mechanics of our complex world, and we will see you next time.